些观点。下一个报告人呢是来自加州大学 Sacramento 分校的 Julian Halil 教授，他发言的题目是拿什么取而代之关于基于市场的教育改革的再讨论。Dr. Julian Halil, please.
Wait, don't start my timer, please. So I think that what I'm going to talk about today actually dovetails really nicely with the speakers that came before me. So what I'd like to talk about today is reframing the debate about market-based education reform. And market-based education reform is probably one of the hottest topics in the United States in terms of our conversations around education policy, whether it be vouchers, charter schools, social impact bonds, etc. Quickly about myself, I'm at Cal State Sacramento, professor of Educational Leadership Policy Studies. I'm also the education chair for the California NAACP. NAACP is an organization that represents people of color. It's a civil rights organization in the United States. I'm also a National Education Policy Center fellow. And I also founded a blog called Cloaking Inequity, and in fact, people from China have read my blog, as well as people from 190 other countries, nearly 1 million people. This talk's dedicated to Dr. Harold Stevenson, University of Michigan professor and mentor, and a professor who is very prominent here in China. So quickly, I just want to say this is my 20th anniversary in China. I lived in Haibian in 1996, and I worked for the Chinese Academy of Sciences, Institute of Psychology. I used to ride my bike right down this street, so it's good to be home. So quickly, let me talk about the U.S. education context. You've heard the bad news. Students of color, minority students, poor students, they have what's called an achievement gap. They underperform in urban districts, in rural districts, etc. That's the really bad news. But there's also some good news, folks. The NAEP scores have been rising for almost 30 years. But there's also some bad news with the NAEP scores. If you look at Sean Reardon's work out of Stanford, the slope of improvement during the era of accountability actually slowed. And in fact, last year, ground to a halt. Now, in the United States, we always like to talk about how the students of today are much less smart than the students of yesterday. But it turns out, if you look at the NAEP scores, the students of today are as smart as they've been since we've been keeping track. Now, there's some arguments around this fact, but the graduation rates are higher than they've ever been. Now, I've talked about this on my blog, but they are higher than they've ever been. And we also know that our top students in the United States compare with the top students in other countries. As Bill Murray says in the movie Stripes, that's the facts, Jack. So there are some peaks of excellence in our country. So there's some good news and the bad news. The real issue is an issue of inequality in our country. That's the real issue that we have in the United States of America. Now, market-based reforms rose purportedly to address this inequality in society. The idea was that we would privatize school services, education support professionals, like cafeteria services, bus services, these sorts of things. Then there's conversations about how popular charter schools are, with large waiting lists and large numbers of people at capitals lobbying for more charter schools. We also have a new thing that you're probably just hearing about is social impact bonds. What social impact bonds do in the new ESSA law, that's the law that replaced No Child Left Behind, is it essentially privatizes investments in reform. And so what happens is that Goldman Sachs and other companies make an investment in pre-K or something else, and if there's a return, then the locality pays the bankers for that investment that they made, and that is in the ESSA. Also, we have vouchers and neo-vouchers. Of course, Kevin Wellner, who directs the National Education Policy Center, is an expert on neo-vouchers. These are tax credit scholarships, taxpayer saving grants, so that students can go to private schools using public money. And over the last 20 years, the federal and state governments have spent hundreds of millions of dollars on charter schools and voucher programs. Now, what are the claims behind the market-based reforms in the United States? Well, that school choice helps poor students, helps minority students. That market actually puts the power back in the hands of parents via choice. That dollars should follow children. That schools are more innovative with markets. And that studies show market-based reforms are great. In fact, the Friedman Foundation released 13 studies that they showed market-based reform improved success of students. Now, what they probably didn't want you to do is look carefully at the fine print and see that of those 13 studies, only 1 or 2 of them were peer-reviewed, and the other 12 were funded by pro-market reform foundations and organizations. So is education reform about civil rights? Well, Milton Friedman, who later won the Nobel Prize, what did he say about vouchers? The ideal way to get rid of public schools, to get rid of neighborhood public schools, is vouchers. In fact, what vouchers allow us to do is foment segregated schools. One of the speakers talked about that previously. That's the elephant in the room, folks. That's the elephant in the room in the United States of America, is that Americans are okay with inequality. They're okay with segregating students by race and by class. In fact, we don't have to go to Finland to see beautiful education reforms. You only have to go to the other side of the tracks, or the other side of the river, or the other side of the highway, in any American city. In Austin, it's the east side of town. In Lansing, Michigan, my hometown, it's the east side of town. In Austin, it's the west side of town. Because the beautiful schools, the schools that have $60 million American football stadiums, and a matching $60 million performing arts center, students of color and poor students, they don't attend those districts in the United States of America. Our real issue is that we are okay with inequity in the United States of America. It's the elephant in the room. But market proponents say that choice is the civil rights issue of our time. Rachel Campos Duffy, who actually is associated with Libre, which is funded by the Koch brothers, which are millionaires from the Midwest, or billionaires, I should say. A natural gateway to civil rights is school choice. It's the civil rights issue of our day, which clearly demonstrates the stark differences between what the two parties offer minorities and those seeking upward mobility. In the Texas Education Review article, I demonstrated that choice is a civil rights issue, but not as it's being framed in the current market-based reform context. First, school choice on average, as you look across the research studies. In fact, I pinged 10 of the top researchers in educational choice, including Gary. And I asked them, give me the research studies, the peer-reviewed research studies that review equity and access writ large across the charter sector. What does the predominance of the research literature say? Overall, and I'm not indicting any particular charter school or any particular traditional public school, but overall, the sector has very serious issues with equity and access for students of color and poor students. And for those of you that are aware of Chile, vouchers did the same thing in Chile over the last 2 decades. We've written 2 peer-reviewed articles. One of my students, it works for the Chilean Ministry of Education. That is what happens with markets. There's winners and losers. And the folks that are losers in those markets are those that don't have capital to wield. And capital, not just monetary capital, but test score capital, transportation capital, and all the other capital that's necessary in the market. Second, school choice has created a motley alliance between privatizers, neoliberals, and traditional civil rights proponents, even folks within the civil rights communities, those that defend minorities in our country. Now, let me just go back 20 years. One of the things that really impressed me about China when I was here in 1996 is that China put minorities on their money. And that blew me away when I saw the minority groups on the Chinese money, because we know in the United States of America who's on our money. Now, that being said, we believe that Harriet Tubman will be on our currency in a few years, but I think that that is a real indictment of the context in which minority students live in our country. As we see in New Orleans, The latest work by Leonard Erling Hammond and Frank Adamson shows that they've created a market tiering of schools. That white students go to the upper tier schools, and there's very few black students and Latino students that have access to those schools. Now, W.E.B. Du Bois, who was a prominent scholar and one of the founders of the NAACP Civil Rights Organization, said at the time, in his early writings, he talked about the talented 10. Now, what privatizers have done is they've paraded the talented 10. Yes, it's true that some students of color have access to better schools with market-based solutions, but the vast majority of students in New Orleans are still going to C, D, and F schools, and that's after 10 years of market-based reform. In fact, Louisiana and New Orleans are last and nearly last in all of the education data out there. There's one single study that says that there's an improvement. It's not peer-reviewed. So what instead? I have 5 minutes. So what instead? What I think was really fascinating about the two Chinese speakers that I'm sandwiched between is they've been talking about the local role in education reform. So I think in the research literature, we can look to a set of community-based reforms that are alternatives to this top-down private control and privatization. The United States, the common denominator of vouchers, of high-stakes testing, is that they are top-down and they're privately controlled. What we didn't think about with No Child Left Behind is that it essentially privatized assessment. We handed over hundreds of millions of dollars to private testing companies because we trusted them more than we trusted our educators to assess students. So there's a conceptual approach for community-based policy, and we were just talking about this earlier. Mark Warren has had many years of really interesting work around community-based reform. So the dominant paradigm in the United States has been top-down. It's been about private control and privatization. And it persists in the education reform movement in my country. And this top-down hierarchical models ostracize the community-based alternatives. More research in this area is bringing to the forefront effective areas of community engagement and education policy, local engagement. Over the past 20 years, community organizing has emerged as a powerful form of public engagement in education reform. So what are these specifically? So what I've done here on the left is I've talked about those hot topics. That top-down privatization, private control reforms that have been mentioned today, many of them, for example, value-added teacher modeling, which has been widely discredited in the academic community, but politicians insist on using it. Teach for America, which, as you may know, has an international roots now in Teach for All, which is essentially the private provision of teachers to communities. Corporate and for-profit charters, school closure and district takeover. The latest thing in the United States is that now neoliberals and other top-down private control, they want to take over entire districts. They tried to take over the Dallas district, which has a $1 billion budget. Recently in LA, they decided that they wanted to charterize more than half of the schools. And so their new approach, this new approach, is to take over entire districts writ large. Oakland also another target. Also the privatized high-stakes assessment, which we talked about with No Child Left Behind. And then top-down NCLB accountability, which I think pretty much most Americans agree fell on its face. So what are the community-based alternatives? In terms of teacher value-added modeling, you can use peer assistance and review, which is used in LA and many other places, and there's some really interesting briefs about PAR from Harvard. Collaborative university community partnerships, there was a big to-do about San Francisco Unified School District, and they decided that Teach for America, which is a very powerful political organization in the United States, that sends teachers into school after only 5 weeks of training and only 18 hours of classroom experience. The school board recently voted that they were no longer going to be in San Francisco. Well, I went to the director of teacher certification at Cal State Sacramento, and I said, have you gotten any calls from San Francisco Unified? Because at graduation, we graduated, 50% of our teacher grads were students of color. Many Latinas graduated in that graduation, all certified, prepared to teach in urban schools. And the chair of the department said, we've never heard from San Francisco Unified. And that's really, I think, the challenge is that San Francisco Unified is saying they have 500 openings, but yet we're 80 miles away and they've never given us a call. Community-based charters. Charters don't have to be franchises. They don't have to be for profit. They don't have to be online. I really believe that community-based charters, those that are run by people that are from that community and empower people in the community, are a significantly better alternative. Community schools, which this is going to cost money, folks, because wraparound services like they do with the Harlem Children's Zone, and that they're doing in Austin, Texas, where they turned around Webb Middle School and Reagan High School, require resources. But we often have the conversation about how much money we spend on education. But the wealthy throw money at education in the United States. They send their kids to Montessori schools, they buy expensive houses in neighborhoods where their property taxes are high. And so my mother always said, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. So what we really don't want to do is throw money in education for poor kids. Community-based assessment, the New York Performance Coalition, is a long-standing group of high schools that conducts assessment on the community level. And then finally in California, one of the most exciting, I think, things is that California has been undertaking local accountability, which is essentially the opposite of George W. Bush's top-down, no child left behind accountability. I have 5 seconds. So we could talk more about local accountability later, but essentially it's strategic plans on the local and state, county level, and it's where communities are involved in the processes to develop their accountability instead of it being determined elsewhere. Please check out Cloaking Equity and connect with me on Twitter and Facebook if you have VPN, and jvh@alumni.stanford.edu if you have any questions. Thank you. I look forward to future conversations.
来自杭州下城区教育局的黄伟局长，他发言的题目是区域教育资源的统筹与开发。好，局长请。